Human Rights Day is celebrated annually around the world on the 10th of December. The date was chosen to honor the United Nations General Assembly's adoption and proclamation in 1948. This was the first global enunciation of human rights and one of the first major achievements of the new United Nations. Many years later, there's a crisis of human rights violations in the Southern African development community, and the body is showing unwillingness apparently to hold each other accountable. Let's find out from Anneke Meerkotter, who is the Executive Director of the Southern African Litigation Center now, in terms of what's the outlook in terms, well, according to what you have observed, right, in SADC, where human rights is concerned. Good morning.
Good morning, Didi.
What has been your assessment of the upholding of human rights, for lack of a better phrase, in SADC? How would you assess how Southern African nations are doing?
Good question. I think it's not so much about what SADC is doing, because as ordinary citizens throughout the region, we don't actually come across SADC much. We don't know who the leadership are. Ordinary people would not necessarily know. We know that our leaders in the different countries are in these bodies, but you very seldom hear authoritative value statements coming from these bodies that actually guide the citizens and our countries in the region. And just to take a step back, I think when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, it was adopted coming out of 2 world wars, and across the world countries agreeing that we need to have a human rights framework, and that human rights framework has to acknowledge that everyone is equal, that everyone is entitled to dignity. Because without that, you cannot have a society that is without conflict, and that so you have to accept that diversity. And I think that's my biggest concern for our region, that increasingly across the board in all our countries, we are becoming less accepting of diversity, less accepting of human rights. It's very much a scramble for everyone for themselves. And we've very much lost the values espoused by people like Desmond Tutu. We're now a year after his death. And it's tragic for me, really, how many of those values have gone out of the windows, how we don't hear any leaders in any country speaking about those values of humanity, of respect, of diversity and equality and those sort of things. And I think without those value statements, that is when you find that in all our countries we find the slipping away of human rights. People's human rights are trampled on in different ways every day, especially the poor throughout our region. So I think we're not doing very well. And unfortunately, we don't really have many leaders to look up to inspire us to do better.
We'll get into the leaders in a few moments. You spoke of societies being less accepting of diversity. Why? What are some of the factors that lead to that? You mentioned poverty. Is there a fight for resources on the ground, and how does that play itself out?
Well, I think across the world we have seen an increase or rise in populism. And that populism and that opportunism that goes with leadership who espouse those sort of populist sort of rhetoric, it does really take advantage of where people find themselves today. I think everyone across the board finds that it's every day just a little bit harder to get by with the income they were earning, or a little bit harder to find a job. And with climate change, with wars in other countries that's also increasing migration, you will find across the region that there is an increase in a perception that there's less resources available, and therefore less willingness to share. I don't think, but unfortunately I think a lot of that intolerance comes from statements that aren't necessarily correct at all. And you find that intolerance across the board, where you have, for example, xenophobia based on arguments around crime, which there's no specific proof to validate those arguments, but yet it's gotten hold in a population, and that's a basis to sort of, a basis for hostility. And I think that's for us the key thing, that we have to live the values of Desmond Tutu, that there is no scientific or other basis ever for discrimination, for intolerance. Doesn't matter where you find yourself in society.
Who has the right to enjoy human rights? Maybe if we look at prison systems in Southern Africa, you find some complaints in countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, maybe just those two that I can think of at the moment. But in terms of conditions of prisoners and their quality of life, right? So it's not about rehabilitation, but it's dehumanizing the person. So who has the right to enjoy human rights, really?
So I remember there's a saying by Dostoevsky and Mandela that we assess our society based on how it treats people in prisons. And if how we treat people in prisons is how we assess us, then we're doing very badly. And I want to give a graphic example, and I know this might be upsetting, but this is to explain that prisons isn't somewhere, it's a horrific place. So in Malawi, for example, the prisons are so overcrowded that at night when prisoners have to go into their cells, they actually have to start packing them into the cells at 3 o'clock in the afternoon so that they all can fit, which literally means squashing them side by side in. And then they lay in that position until they let out 9 o'clock the next morning. They can't relieve themselves, they can't move. That is not that is not humanity. That's not treating people in a humane way. Yet it's something that's happening every single day in prisons across our region to thousands of people. In Malawi specifically, people have been without food in prisons for weeks on end. And even prison warders would contact us and say, listen, we don't know what to do because people are just lying. The elderly, the sick, they're just lying there because they have lost all hope. The kitchens are closed, those sort of things. So I think with us in society being so caught up in our daily lives, it's easy for us to say, let's not care about prisoners. There's enough bad things happening. But those are people as we are people. Our humanity is interlinked, and they also come from families. They also have children. They also want to improve their lives. So that for me is the scariest thing, the fact that despite all our human rights standards, all the laws in all our countries that says prisoners must have so much space, they must get food every day, all of that is actually just thrown out of the window. And we treat someone who once committed a crime, sometimes often based on necessity, and because they had no food or something, we treat them as if that makes them criminals and if that's the only thing that makes them them. And I think that's our problem throughout society. We label people and we judge people not based on them as a person, but based on their sexual orientation or their race or which country they come from, or whether they're in prison or what their education levels are, and that is not okay. And that sort of is contrary to the entire principles underlying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
You spoke of leadership. So in the absence of leadership from bodies such as SADC, according to your observation, what then is the call as International Human Rights Day is being celebrated to the everyday person?
Well, my call firstly to the leaders would be to actually tell us what you think. I know there's often AU and SADC meetings where the leadership from the different countries would come together and really debate on issues that's happening in the different countries where there's conflict and those sort of things. And often those bodies are very helpful in trying to resolve those situations. But what they need to do is convey what they're doing to the rest of the people and communities in Africa, because we need to see that they themselves are upset about things that are happening and that they want to change that. That would be the first thing, so we as communities can then have trust in our leadership, which I think that's lacking. And once you lack trust in your leadership, you sort of feel, well, I just need to look after myself because no one's going to do it for me. And with that comes a lot of selfishness, a lot of prioritization of oneself above others. And I think what my call would be is for us just all to realize that we're in this together. We have to uplift each other. It's the only way how we can create a future generation and a country in the future that's actually going to sustain us and that's going to be prepared to deal with the difficulties that might come in the future around climate change and those sort of things. We have to prepare ourselves by changing how we relate to each other.
Anneke Meerkotter, Southern Africa Litigation Centre Executive Director, thank you.